Hello, everybody. I hope you all had a good lunch and you're ready to move on to this afternoon's programming. The next panel will follow me talking a little bit about our sponsors. We have a terrific group of sponsors this year again, ranging from law firms, news organizations, and of course, the State Bar of Georgia. Council of State Court Judges, Council of Probate Court, Judicial Council of Georgia, Council of Superior Court Judges. We're grateful to all these sponsors for all they do, both in in-kind services and help, and also financial contributions. And don't forget to think about sponsoring us next year. I now want to talk about our next panel, and it's called Meeting the Moment, Racial Justice, Law Enforcement, and the Right to Protest. How will elected officials, law enforcement, in our communities effectively move forward? The organizer for this session is Meredith Kincaid, a partner with the Somerville law firm. She went to UT Law School. Fun fact about her, she also went to UNC, where she got a bachelor's in piano music performance. So someone who can think not only musically, but also in the courtroom on your feet. So with that, I'd like to introduce Meredith Kincaid to take it away.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am thrilled to have this esteemed group of panelists here today to talk about racial justice, law enforcement, and the right to protest. We could obviously spend days covering these complex and nuanced issues, but for now, I'm grateful to have even just an hour and a half of this panel's time to discuss them. Now, without further ado, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our moderator and co-organizer, Lisa Cupid. Lisa is an attorney and former engineer. She was first elected to serve on the Cobb County Board of Commissioners in November 2012, and was most recently elected as chair of the Board of Commissioners in November 2020. We appreciate her guidance and counsel in helping to organize this panel. Please join me in welcoming Chairwoman Lisa Cupid.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you to all of the organizers of this conference, and certainly to all of our distinguished panelists who are here today. I am pleased to have join us today 4 persons who were involved in a lot of the events that unfolded last year with respect to this topic. And the first one is a friend and colleague here in Cobb County, DA Flynn Broady, who was recently elected to office in November 2020. We are grateful to have him serve, and even prior to him serving as DA, he was with our solicitor's office in Cobb County, and prior to that had an extensive history, I believe 26 years serving in the military on behalf of our country. Flynn, thank you for joining us today, and you can feel free to turn on your video. Thank you. Next with us is also a former colleague, John Melvin, who was with the DA's office and now is Assistant Director at the Georgia Bureau of Investigations. As second in command, he directs the operations and administration of this organization's 920 agents and staff. We appreciate him being here and understand he has a military background and attending the United States Military Academy, UGA, and also Ohio Northern University. We appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to be with us today.
Thank you.
Also with us, we have a friend and colleague of mine, Tiffany Roberts. Tiffany Roberts is an attorney with the Southern Center for Human Rights and serves as their community engagement and movement building council. She is also a civil rights and criminal defense attorney in Atlanta, and she has been quite involved in a number of efforts to address grassroots organizations and persons who are on the front lines and trying to address issues of civil justice here in Atlanta. Thank you for joining us today. And Tiffany, I don't see Tiffany with us, so hopefully she will join us. But in addition to those 3, we have here Jasmina, Alston, who is a reporter with CBS 46 in Atlanta, and who came to us in Atlanta, from Birmingham, Alabama, where she also served as a multimedia journalist. And prior to that, she was actually from Atlanta. She went to my alma mater for law school, which is Georgia State. Go Panthers. It's glad to see that even though you left the state, that you've been back to Atlanta and that you were here for a very pivotal time. In fact, I recall seeing you and look forward to having a discussion with you over the next 90 minutes. And I understand, Tiffany, you're with us, so glad that you are here. My screen may be limited. But I just want to provide some context to all of those who are joining us here for this conversation today. If you can remember, it seems like 2020 was so long ago with all that's transpired. But in 2020, we had a lot happen. As you can recall, we had a presidential election that was underway, a pandemic that certainly had our entire county and our communities in greater stress than what we could have ever imagined. And we also saw protests erupt here across the nation and even some internationally as well. It's remarkable to see what unfolded, but some would say it was a long time coming with some of the things that had occurred prior to those events. Those events, certainly we have a long and complex history of dealing with social justice issues within our country. And before we get into the specific interest that you may have in your profession, I just wanted to ask each of our panelists generally what your thoughts are and what led to that moment, what you think some of the background issues were, whether it was by way of policy issues that you may deal with on a legal level, maybe some things you observed as a journalist, or some things you may know from your knowledge of history in this country. So with that, I'm going to turn things over first to DA Flynn Broady.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with our history. For minorities here in the United States, for a long time, the criminal justice system has been used to stop them or to hold them down. And as a result, we continue to be oppressed and continue to see things in a different light than most Americans. And with that, time to step up and to protest and to sound off has been ever present due to the fact that people are just tired. They're just tired of the hate. They're just tired of the intolerance. They're tired of the divisiveness that we've seen in this country over the last 8 years. And I think going forward, I think our country is ready to change and make things better.
Thank you, DA. Jasmina, if you can share with us your thoughts.
I definitely agree as far as our history goes and just people being tired of that oppression and the systematic racism that we've always seen. And I think last year with the killing of George Floyd specifically, it was a breaking point for many people. And the video that we saw of his killing was played so often and it was so disturbing. And it was something that I think just sort of made people say, okay, enough is enough. We're going to protest, and our goal is going to be to have our voices heard and to make a change. And I think another thing that sort of tied into that was the fact that when the protest started, we were in a pandemic. So a lot of people were at home and they had time to sit and to watch and to think and say, this is something I want to be a part of. And I think that's sort of where we saw, the protests happening and the length of time for those protests as well. And the amount of people involved also, because everyone had that time to think.
I agree. John, if you can give us your perspective on what you think led to the events that unfolded last year. And I see we're having some difficulty. Yes, you're on mute, John, if you can help us. There we go. We'd much rather hear you than just see.
I agree completely with what's been said before. At the age of 56 and being a native Atlantean, I was raised in a city where we still had segregated water fountains. I mean, my lifetime. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't just generations and generations ago. It's been within our lifetime where there was systemic racism and government involvement. When the video of George Floyd came out, it was replayed, to go to what Jasmina, I mean, that was horrific. And to just see that over and over and over again, I know within myself, there was just a wellspring of anger about what could lead to that. And so you look and you have to speak out, because when you don't speak out on issues like that, when you allow silence, then you allow the perpetrators of that kind of hate to keep on going. So I'm thankful for everybody that spoke out. I'm thankful for every church that preached a sermon, every synagogue that wrote a missive. I mean, it was time for people to speak up, speak out, and just say, this is not going to be tolerated anymore.
Yeah. Thank you, Johnny. I appreciate those remarks. And Tiffany, if you can give us your perspective on what you believe helped lead to the number of events that unfolded last year.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I think that what we saw in 2020 was a very clear message from communities that have been impacted by these systems, that we will continue to honor our traditions of organizing and resistance. I think that what is present in this moment is an acknowledgement of intergenerational leaders across the country, saying that we recognize that things don't just change because we wish them to change, that we have to embrace the necessity to act. And we saw this summer that people were willing to do that, even when we knew that the coronavirus could cause their death, right? Any protests that we were planning, we were having to also think about ensuring not only that people didn't come home injured, but that they did not come home and infect people in their households. But the killing of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor, the killing of Ahmaud Arbery came after a string of killings, the killing of Trayvon Martin, the killing of Michael Brown, right? So many others, and even some in our city in Atlanta that don't get talked about as much. So this is a part of what some of our mentors call the protracted struggle. And I think I am, for one, really grateful to have people in our communities who can tell us what it was like to organize, even in times before this.
Thank you. The reason I started off with that question is because regardless of our profession and how it touches these issues, all of these events impacted us personally on, a human level. And I think it's important that we keep that in context as we determine how we move forward and address these issues, that we are not just addressing this from a technical perspective, but we have all been individually touched and carry that with us as we try to address policy. But moving in towards more of the professional end of our perspective, I'd like to start off my first question directly to Jasmina. With George Floyd's death, we saw massive protests here in Atlanta and essentially throughout the world. Jasmina, you reported on some of these protests and in some instances of law enforcement responding to these protests. One that particularly sticks out to mind to me is a story on 2 college students tased by police. And we actually have a video here from CBS 46 that I'd like to play of that. And then get your perspective on what you saw on the ground during the protests.
Behind the wheel has been
just to give you a little
tased.
background, we were here on the scene. We turn around and we see several officers go up to the car and start breaking the glass. We're not sure what led up to this. There was a woman in the front passenger seat and a gentleman in the driver's seat. They're pulling him out now. Now, of course, the crowd has caught on to what's happened. We have no idea what led to this. They flattened the tire, broke the glass to the car, and I hear what I believe to be a taser. So you can see this young woman is being arrested, was taken out of the car, and then on the other side, we've got the driver who is also being arrested and several officers around him. I have no idea what exactly led up to this.
Yeah, so Jasmina, can you give us some perspective of what you experienced on the ground as a reporter?
Here we go. Can you guys hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Okay. So just a little background there before we get to the video. This was part of the protests for the killing of George Floyd here in Atlanta. And going back to day one, which was a couple of days before that, we knew there was going to be a protest, but I don't think anyone was expecting what was to come with the protests.
Okay.
That first day, large crowds turned out, it was marching and it was very peaceful. And then we started to see, you know, the confrontations that started happening with police and with the protesters. And we sort of knew this is going to be for the long haul and we'll be out here every day to cover it. And in seeing the confrontations with the police and things sort of taking a more aggressive turn, we also saw the introduction of tear gas and we started seeing curfews being put into place. And that's how we got to the video that we just saw. So that particular day was a day that a curfew was put into place for the city. And my photographer and I, we were with the protesters and we were with police and sort of just moving around to, you know, see what was going on and to talk to people. And in that particular moment, we had been walking with the police officers as they were sort of trying to push the crowds out from that Centennial Olympic Park area. It all happened very quickly, as you can see. I looked up and I just remember seeing one of the cars, all of the cars were sort of stopped right there by that Waffle House near Centennial Olympic Park. And we noticed that a group of officers were going towards this particular car. And my first instinct, of course, was, hey, we've got the camera here. Let's start rolling. Let's see what's happening. We didn't know what led up to it at that point in time. We were just sort of going off of what we were seeing. And you saw in the video, it wasn't as clear on my angle, but you could see that they broke the glass to the car. They were pulling what we later learned to be students out of the car. They were tased. And of course, that caused a lot of commotion with some of the other protesters who wanted to see what was going on. And what happened after that incident was what sort of struck me as very interesting about the entire incident, because I know one of the questions that was posed on the document I read was, did we have any issues finding out more about what happened with that incident? And the answer is no, we didn't, because it was caught on camera and because that video went viral so quickly, we saw consequences and action being taken immediately after. And I thought that was one of the more interesting things about what happened with that video, just sort of thinking, hey, what wouldn't have happened had we not been there?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting perspective of what the power of video can do. That once it's out there, then it allows those other perhaps hurdles to be quickly overcome as far as getting access to information. And what I'm hearing from you is because that camera was rolling, that it made all of that other information come forth a lot quicker than what perhaps you typically would have expected.
Right. And just the chain reaction of what we saw. So after the incident, I reached out to Atlanta police for an incident report and the body cam video, and all of that came very quickly. We got body cam video from several of the officers involved. We got the incident reports. We learned more about the students, Tanaya and Messiah, who we learned later were college students here in Atlanta at Morehouse and at Spelman. And then eventually we saw the officers were fired. We saw they were charged with using excessive force. And there was also the story of just following up with the students to see how this impacted them. And it's still an incident, still a case that is happening today as we speak.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that perspective. And thank you for being out there and for your great coverage of that event and the entire protest that took place that day. The next question is directed towards you, Tiffany. There were nearly 600 arrests of protesters in Metro Atlanta in just a 2-week period in June surrounding these events. Your organization, the Southern Center for Human Rights, and others quickly mobilized to help many of the protesters in finding pro bono legal counsel and connecting them with resources. What type of conduct were protesters being arrested for, and what type of charges were being brought against them?
Sure. So the majority of the charges we saw were curfew related. And so that means that like those students that we just talked about, Messiah Young and Tanaya Pilgrim, actually participated in the press conference following them being brutalized by APD. And they were, approached allegedly because of the curfew, and then also because the officers said that they feared that there was a gun from this Morehouse student and this Spelman student. But most of the people were arrested related to the curfew. I did a quick look at our spreadsheet. 132 people for pedestrian in the roadway. Only 2 for attempting to incite a riot, which is, as we as lawyers know, can be such a broad allegation that can be reduced to something like a Facebook post, depending on who's doing the charging. And then about 22 for disorderly conduct. And that is not for all of the people who are arrested during the uprisings. This is just the list of folks we know of, right? And we only know about them because of the really coordinated and commendable organizing community in Atlanta. It's really unfortunate that people are still braving COVID to go into city court to fight these charges. Solicitor Gamage in Fulton County has dismissed many of the charges that were routed to Fulton County State Court. And we are now fortunate to be working with Solicitor Raines Carter to try to find a way to resolve these cases. But for months, we have been attempting to get the mayor to weigh in on this. And during the time that the curfew was enforced, we were urging the mayor to drop the curfew, and even we sent 4 letters, a total of 4 letters, the earliest one being in August, because we believe that the enforcement of the curfew was not lawful because of the way that it was implemented across the city. And so these people who are arrested, it just needs to be stated again, are going into courtrooms during a pandemic to fight charges like curfew and pedestrian in the roadway. And that in large part to the behavior and the policies of the Atlanta Police Department during the uprisings.
Thank you. And you started talking a little bit about policy, and this one wasn't necessarily on the list of policies that were shared with our panelists, but I'm curious to know, the response to the protests that were occurring was to put curfews in place. And you provided that you felt that the way it was implemented was unlawful. For you or for any of our other panelists, and particularly DA Broady and John, can you provide, is there a way to lawfully implement a curfew or other policies or procedures when you have a protest?
I can share what we tried to raise with the city were 3 things, but the main 2 things were, one, that the protests were only happening in a small part of town, but the curfew was being enforced citywide. Well, in theory, was being enforced citywide, but really selectively enforced. The second part was selectively enforced primarily around Centennial Olympic Park and the CNN Center. And so the curfew was functioning as sort of a city-funded private security for certain buildings and places within downtown Atlanta. And we pointed the city to places like Los Angeles, Manhattan, Chicago, Dallas, and Denver. Even those that had implemented curfews over the summer had broadly dismissed protest-related charges, especially those relating to curfew. And so those 3 things were sort of the focus of our correspondence to the city and prosecutors in Atlanta.
Interesting. John or Flynn, do you have any thoughts regarding that?
I'll DA Broady, if you'd like to go first, I'll follow.
Well, my thoughts on the curfew is I think, like Tiffany said, it was put in place not to enforce it throughout the city, but just to enforce it right there in that small area where the protests were taking. And so what you're basically doing is taking a lot of the basic rights of a person away by doing that. And it was more or less designed to stop the protests instead of for a good reason. And I think that's probably an issue, because at the time, the protests weren't violent at that particular time, but they did become violent later. And so then I could see the implementation of a curfew from that point on.
Okay,
And John, whatever you want to add.
So I was at the State Operations Command Center during the protest and when the rioting started, and I actually went down to where the troops were within 15 feet of protesters. And I think when we look back on it, we need to kind of remember the context of what was going on. The night that Jasmina video came out, there were so many shots fired. You could hear them. It was like the 4th of July. There was a command that came out, and I believe it was 6-7, which means maintain radio silence except for the absolute worst. In other words, don't do a police call out over the radio simply because there's a shot fired, because there's so many going on. At the same time, explosive devices were being thrown at law enforcement. Frozen bottles of water were being thrown at law enforcement. Antifa and intelligence proved that Antifa was dropping off piles of rocks and bricks throughout the city to be thrown at law enforcement. So the curfew that we're talking about was, and by this time, millions of dollars of damage had been done in the city of Atlanta, and over $1 million to just Atlanta police officer vehicles. And I think Chairperson Cupid, I mean, imagine Cobb County getting $1 million hit overnight.
Yeah.
So that's the context of what we're talking about. And a citywide curfew was put into effect, but you're talking about how it was only implemented in certain areas, and the areas that it was really implemented on were the areas where extreme property damage was being done and violence was being done.
I see.
So it's easy to Monday morning quarterback, and those officers that were working, the officers at the time were working 20-hour shifts, exhausted beyond measure. And by large part, the protests were not violent, but where it was violent, it was very violent. And the laws that were in place allowed the officers to take action. And that's the result of, and with over 600 arrests, sure, some of them need to go away, but there's other of them that was the bare minimum that should have been charged.
Thank you. And what I'm hearing from everyone, there's perhaps some desire to have a policy in place, but there's some question about how broad that policy should be. Should it be for an entire municipality? Should it be for a particular location? And, you know, what's the context around it? If there are violent acts that are occurring, you know, it certainly may be viewed as more justifiable than in just imposing something because there's a perception that something could occur without there being evidence of that. And you're right, there certainly is Monday, as you said, I don't watch football, but Monday night after Monday night quarterbacking that takes place as we assess policy. And that's what we're doing today, because, you know, what we don't want is to wake up and see other events like this occurring, you know, in our future. And so, you know, having your perspective on things that transpired is certainly helpful for us and for those who may be viewing. So I'm going to ask you some questions, or to all of our panelists, some questions on some policies, which we've had a lot of questions about following the events of last year. And one of them is, I'm going to piggyback off of Jasmina's statements about the usefulness of having camera footage on site of the events that she covered. But I'd like to get everyone's thoughts on the specific policy of whether law enforcement should be required to wear body cameras. And John, since we left off with you, I'll start with you, and then I will refer to the other panelists.
If you're doing your job right, body cameras shouldn't be a problem at all. I think it would behoove us to also recognize that the officers that were on that video have been reinstated, not based on substantive guilt or innocence, but based on the procedures of how their termination went. So the terminations have been overturned. And the good that cameras like CBS 46 bring about, it also, we got to be very careful that we don't allow it to give us a rush to judgment judgment because we don't know the attendant circumstances of what's going on with that. Body cameras, though, I think in situations like this can be very helpful because we not only get what the news media has shown us, but we can also get the perspective of the law enforcement officer that may or may not be charged in an incident like this. So body cameras, I think it's a good thing. Now, there are times when body cameras are problematic, like interviewing the victim of child rape. We got to think about policies on how to handle very sensitive situations to stand up for the rights of victims as well.
Thank you, John. DA Broady, do you have any thoughts regarding that?
No, I think John is correct. It's always great to have a body camera to not only protect the public, but also to protect the officers. It's critical that we see the officer's point of view, because sometimes the camera from CBS or NBC, it may show us a certain angle that where we don't see what the officer sees. And that can be critical, especially in a situation where there may be a gun that the offender has or something like that, that based on the angle, you can't see that gun, but the officer can see it. And I think that's critical for the officers. Not only does it protect us, but it protects them also. And I think just like John said, we don't want to rush to judgment just because of what we've seen on the video, because there's always different aspects that the video may not cover. And so it's always good to have the video as part of the evidence, but also have the testimonies and the statements from others to fill in all the pieces. And that way we can do things the right way the first time around.
Thank you. Tiffany, do you have any thoughts on whether body cameras should be required by police officers?
So I 2 years ago, or maybe just a year ago, no, 2 years ago, an organizer named Oscar Kane Jr., who organized with me around body cameras, was killed by the Atlanta Police Department by an officer who had not activated his body camera. And so whenever I think about the body cameras issue, I always think about Oscar and how even though the Atlanta Police Department had body cameras, that there was later an audit demonstrating that they weren't really using them. And so we had to push for improved standard operating procedures around body cameras. And this was an audit that Chief Erica Shields commissioned. They, conducted an audit and tried to figure out why certain officers weren't activating their cameras and why they weren't following protocols when it comes to what we do with footage of use of force, right? How do we catalog that footage in contrast to other footage that may be benign or irrelevant to litigation? So I say all that to say that I don't want to diminish the role of body cameras in providing another way to keep evidence, right, of certain acts, even if we're not talking about crimes, or to preserve evidence or to collect evidence. However, there are studies demonstrating that police forces having access to body cameras does not necessarily reduce the incidence of police violence. And so people need to be aware of the fact that, if law enforcement has a tool, even if that tool can in some circumstances provide us with evidence of how something happened, that doesn't get to the core of behaviors. And so I would prefer that police departments embrace policies that make the use of force less likely. And I think that we talk a lot about, so I am the sister of a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. My family is full of military and other people who get a certain amount of respect because they have a uniform and a gun. But I think we have to also think about different ways to address the way that law enforcement can behave in certain communities. As a public defender, I would encounter young people who were not even surprised if they were beaten by police. They expected it. And what they would say was, Miss Williams, because I was a Williams at the time, I just don't understand why he couldn't have just hit me in my stomach. Why did he have to hit me in my face? Instead of us having to have the conversation about, actually, he didn't have to hit you in your face either. And so body cameras need to, if police officers have them, we really need to think about how they're accountable for what they capture and when they're used. And we should not elevate body cameras to be sort of a moral compass or a guardian for police officers, because they certainly cannot do that. That is the job of the leadership within law enforcement, and that is the job of the executive that control law enforcement in a given municipality or county.
Jasmina, any thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, so as a journalist, I definitely think body cameras, dash cam video, all of that is very important because it gives us another angle. Like John mentioned with my video, once we got that body cam footage, we were able to see different angles and different perspectives of what was happening. And it also gives us the audio to hear what was going on in the moment, something that we were not able to hear when we were filming. Another example where body cam and dash cam video played a huge role was the killing of Rayshard Brooks. That gave us, so much insight into what happened with his killing. So I definitely think body cameras are important, especially for what we do and getting that video out there, getting that audio out there.
Thank you. This is not a question that was posed to our panelists, but as I'm listening to the conversation, I know this is a continual policy issue that we deal with here at the local level, and that some of you may deal with as events are captured on camera. I know that typically when there are police investigations, that footage is not released if it was captured by a police officer. I'd like to get some thoughts on that policy and I'll start with you, Jasmine, and whether or not you think we should just provide that footage immediately, or do you perceive that there is a reason why that shouldn't occur?
So personally, in my time here, I've not had any incidents where I've asked for body cam footage and didn't get it in a timely manner. I can certainly understand, and John might be able to speak more on this. I can certainly understand there are some times when it's just not possible to release it at a certain point. But with the protests, there were so many incidents that happened. And each time that we asked Atlanta Police Department for body cam or dash cam video, we did get it in a timely manner. And I'm sure a lot of that had to do with the fact that there was so much pressure on the department from everything that happened during that time span of the protests.
Thank you. Tiffany, any comments with respect to that?
So it has been a while since I've had to request a video for a particular case, but I can say that after the killing of Oscar Kane, Southern Center sent a rather robust open records request to the Atlanta Police Department for footage, or actually not even for footage, for files concerning body camera footage of use of force and all of the attendant documentation that the SOP required. And that process took several months. What it illuminated, though, was the need for improvements in the way that the department was maintaining those records, right? Okay. It's 2021. We should have a digital database of not only the footage, we should have digital catalogs, and we should be able to press Control F or whatever it is and find what we are looking for. As a public defender, I really didn't have, and as a private attorney, really didn't have a lot of trouble getting a hold of dash cam footage, but I have heard from public defenders in jurisdictions with really high caseloads that there is sometimes a lag, but that probably goes to volume rather than anything else.
Very good. DA Broady, I know you've had a recent matter with respect to this, and just like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of releasing any video early. And the reason because that just like the case that you're talking about, and I don't want to name the name because I don't want to have the family, it incites people's emotions. And one of the things that we want to make sure we do is we follow the law and not others' emotions. And that can be an issue when we have video that gets released too early without all the facts. And I think this is what happened in our case, is that the video had been seen and people were emotionally attached to what happened, not because of whether they were following the law, but because of who was involved.
Yeah.
And I think that's an issue that we have to look out for. Anytime we're completing an investigation, we want to hold that until we actually have the investigation completed, that the jurors have had their say in it. So that way we don't inflame any opinions. We don't base our decisions on emotions, but we base it on the law. So I think it's critical that we have a balance there.
Thank you, DA Broady. John.
Transparency is always a great thing because it really builds trust, but DA Brody's right, especially when you know that some of the situations are going to have to be presented to a grand jury. You want them as unbiased as possible to make a decision based upon the law. And when videos get leaked in certain cases, then opinions you have divided camps, and people will come into the grand jury room with a predisposition. So for the rule of law, sometimes delay is a good thing. But in other situations, really quick transparency really helps to build the trust of the community. For example, in Jasmina's situation, where they had the video, Chief Erica Shields released the body cam videos instantaneously. And when you listen to the hearing that she had with Lance Russo on the reinstatement of officers, one of the reasons she did that was to prevent a, quote, powder keg from blowing up. It's a great decision. And that was a case where, hey, the need to prevent further escalation and violence overrides any need to prevent a grand jury from, it was just, and leaders have to make those moment by moment decisions. But I think all of us, and DA Broady included, in public, we want to be as transparent as possible because we want to build trust in the communities that we serve. And there's sometimes when we just can't. Body cam videos, it captures an ongoing investigation. Some of the investigations we've done at the Bureau and that we did in Cobb County, months. And if you release body cam videos as you go, you just blew a whole big investigation. You can't do that. So body cam video release, good thing, but like the book of Ecclesiastes says, everything in its own time, right?
Yeah. It seems like there's a lot of discretion around whether or not it should be released, and some considerations around transparency to prevent issues from getting out of hand, but also a desire to maintain some integrity around the legal process of dispositioning a matter. So I appreciate all of you sharing your perspective on that. So let's get to some other policy interests. I understand that the governor is considering, some modifications to the stand your ground laws, and wanted to get some thoughts on our panel around that. I know I've been starting off with you, John or Jasmina, so I'm going to change things a bit, and I'll start off with you, Flynn, for that question. What is your perspective on abolishing stand your ground laws?
I really don't like the law because it does not have a duty to retreat. And at times people can use deadly force when not necessary. And that's the issue that I have with it, is the ability to use deadly force when it may not be possible or needed is what I'll say. And for many of us, that's a judgment call on that person and how they feel at that particular point. You can have somebody who's 6'3", and the person that's attacking them is 5'2", and they decide to take out a gun, and you say to yourself, well, why did you take out a gun for a 5'2" person? And that deadly force was probably unnecessary, but we don't know how that person felt. We don't know what the fear that person had of that other person, and especially in our domestic violence situations. Now, what I do like about what the governor is doing is the citizens arrest law. That law, I think, is antiquated, and it gives too much discretion to individual citizens without any law enforcement training putting them in a situation where they may try to do something that could actually get themselves harmed. And I think that's an issue. And I think the way they've reduced the ability to make citizens arrest, hopefully they'll pass the law the way they currently have it written. And I think that will be a much better improvement for that law.
Thank you. And thank you for clarifying that the governor is addressing that particular law, not particular stand your ground, and appreciate your perspective on that. Is there any one of our other panelists that want to weigh on this topic? Please feel free to unmute your mic and go ahead.
Yeah, you've got to have a license to cut hair, right? So why would you not have to have a license in order to arrest somebody? And part of what law enforcement undergoes is fairly extensive training on how to properly effectuate an arrest, which when you look at the number of custodial arrests in the United States, every single year, there are somewhere between 12 to 14 million people arrested. And it's in those situations where violence can and takes place. And unfortunately, nationwide, the number is right under 1,000 shootings during the custodial arrest period. And and the interesting thing about the citizens arrest statute is it was passed in 1863. So we're dealing with a Confederate era statute when you had one constable for 100 square miles. So you kind of needed people to be able to say, hey, you've done wrong, let me hold on to you till we can get the justice here. We don't have that anymore. We have 58,000 certified law enforcement officers in the state of Georgia. We don't need people taking right stuff into their own hands when they're not properly trained on how to do it. So I'm really in favor of changing up our citizens arrest laws.
Okay, thank you. And what about your thoughts on the stand your ground law?
If I could defer to the other panelists on that one, I haven't been as involved in that one, so I don't have a base to talk from on that one.
Okay, does anybody else want to chime in?
Sure, I'll chime in on both. So after Ahmaud Arbery was killed, Southern Center and Georgia NAACP founded a coalition called Just Georgia. And through Just Georgia, we began to do policy advocacy both around citizens arrest and stand your ground. And the reasons that we did that were because the two district attorneys that didn't want to prosecute Ahmaud Arbery's killers used those two provisions to justify the actions of those who stalked and murdered him in Brunswick. And so with respect to stand your ground, I think Mr. Broady said right. Without the duty to retreat, what we encourage is a culture in which people are allowed to accost and harass and injure, right? And if they can safely retreat, they don't have to. They can continue their aggression and kill someone. And we know that new generations became aware of this law. Well, let's just name stand your ground is not the same as self-defense, and stand your ground laws in the context of American jurisprudence are new. But people started to talk about stand your ground when Trayvon Martin was killed. The second piece of this is that stand your ground has racially disparate impacts across the country. There's one study that says that in states with stand your ground laws, white men are 11 times more likely to kill, right? And that is because often Black people we are not allowed to accost and harass and injure and then not retreat with the same frequency. And that's a documented fact. With respect to citizens arrest, John said it correctly that it was implemented after enslaved Africans were emancipated in the South. And what Georgia NAACP President James Woodall testified to this summer, because we were successful in getting some legislative hearings about citizens arrest, were that citizens arrest was used in large part to keep newly emancipated population of Black people in the South under control. And so it was never a law that was intended to be applied equally across racial groups. And it is a remnant of chattel slavery, and it should be repealed. And so what House Bill 479 does is it completely repeals citizens arrest and only permits private persons to execute certain detentions, things that you would think about. If I have a store and I think you took something, you got to stick around until I call the police. If I'm a weight inspector and your truck pulls up and I can't let you leave, you got to stick around until I call the appropriate authorities, right? And so it improves our law because it also outlines what private persons are allowed to do during the course of detentions. And it makes it really clear that if you are not a trained law enforcement officer, you are not to execute arrests. So I am hopeful about that legislation. Judge Georgia, Marissa Dodson, James Woodall were critical in getting this before the governor and the legislature. And so hoping by day 40, we have a repeal of citizens arrest.
Thank you. Are there any other thoughts on this topic before we move on to our next policy consideration?
I was just going to throw in, as far as journalism goes, citizen's arrest and the murder of Ahmaud Arbery is another example of the power of video and how you have that story of what happened to Ahmaud Arbery and that video to show to go along with it. That sort of, brings us here now to the story of the citizen's arrest law and saying, this is what happened, and it was on camera and it was awful. So that's another example of what we've been seeing for the last year, where just video is so powerful in telling some of these stories that need to result in change.
I certainly agree. Another policy consideration, and Tiffany, you have some experience with this as you talked about addressing the protesters last year. But what are your thoughts, or anyone's thoughts on this panel around large-scale dismissals of nonviolent offenses of protesters?
I'll just say, of course, I think it's a good thing. I think when people en masse use their First Amendment rights, especially when people are not harmed, any sort of widespread arrests are bad for democracy. And I think that the cities that we cite in our letter, right, because it does not serve, I think we lost John. It serves no public purpose to expend resources that could be better used to prosecute people who were merely being heard about the mass killings or the killings of people in this country because of systemic racism and racist law enforcement.
And Lisa, I totally agree. The right to protest is as American as apple pie, as they say. And so the ability to be able to protest is something that anybody should be able to do. Now, something that John said is some of these antagonists, are the one, and it's very few that are the ones doing all the destruction and the damage. Now, they deserve to be arrested and held for their what's the word I'm looking for their actions. But the right to protest is something that we've always done, and as long as it's done peacefully, there should not be an issue. For the antagonists that want to destroy things and wreak on destruction and just taking advantage of these situations, yes, they need to be held accountable for their actions. But otherwise, I believe wholesale dismissals is the right answer, because these are not people that are dangerous. These are not people who are criminals. They're just there trying to make their voices heard, and that's as American as we can get.
I definitely agree. The right to protest is so important and it's so beautiful. I mean, what we saw here in Atlanta, the large groups of people coming out and protesting and saying enough is enough, and some of the signs that we saw and some of the people that we talked to and hearing people's stories about why they decided to join a movement, why they decided to protest. And in this last year, there were so many people who never thought to go out and protest. They never thought to join a movement or to speak out about anything. And it was just really, it was nice to hear some people say, enough is enough. This is going to be my first time getting out there and protesting. And it was so life-changing for them and for the city of Atlanta too. I mean, it was just, we saw so many powerful images and it really was beautiful. Like you mentioned, there are a few people in the crowd who decide to, damage property or be destructive. But as a whole, what we saw was really powerful.
Yeah. Good. Any other additional comments? Jasmina, and certainly others can weigh in, but something that I've seen covered on the news has been no knock warrants. And just, it seems odd and even disturbing to see the number of mistaken warrants served at the end of last year, particularly when you saw the persons whose homes are entered were older. Can you give me some thoughts for any of our panelists on that specific policy?
So I think with the no knock warrants, this is a good example of when the body cam video helps us a great deal in telling the story. I mean, in a situation like that, that's one of the first things that I think we would request. I mean, we want to see what happened. Why did you go in there? What was that like? And I think that's a huge part of being able to tell that story. But with the no knock warrants, those are stories that we've seen across the country, obviously, come up time and time again. And those have been some pretty disturbing stories.
Yes.
Lisa, you may remember when we were in law school together, a program we did around Catherine Johnston's murder in English,
Yes.
Atlanta. And so when we think about how pervasive it is, or this idea that especially drug enforcement is so critical, that we don't even have to knock, because make no mistake, even if there's a no knock warrant and there's and versus a regular warrant, it's not as though police announce themselves for 15 minutes before they break down the door, right? And so how sad is it that a grandmother can lose her life because of an allegation concerning marijuana, because we think so little of people within our communities? Even when the person who is responsible for a criminal act is inside of the house concerned. Ayanna Stanley Jones is an example of a child who was killed when police kicked in a door, threw in a flashbang. She ignited. Her aunt, who tried to protect her, was then arrested for allegedly assaulting a police officer, but she's literally an aunt looking to grab a baby who's on fire and put the fire out, right? And so we've got to think about the attitudes which support any idea that drug enforcement in particular is that important. We're not talking about hostages. We're not talking about violence. We are talking about controlled substances, right? A wayward war on drugs that we cannot, the consequences of that campaign in America cannot be overstated. And so I think that it's important that we get rid of no knock warrants, but also that we think about any warrant on a person's residence in particular, and the considerations that have to be taken into account before we go into any residence, especially as it relates to drugs.
Thank you.
And Lisa, I totally agree with both Jasmina and Tiffany. We're not in a combat zone, so we should not be throwing in flashbangs. We should not be breaking in doors and firing random shots because we see people. When I saw the Breonna Taylor case, I was just appalled at the actions of the police officers. And then the fact that they even arrested the other young man who was trying to defend his home because he didn't know why they were busting in his home. It's just crazy that we have resorted to that as far as law enforcement is concerned. So we do need to get rid of no-knock warrants. And the thing about the Breonna Taylor case is the person that they were actually looking for was already in custody. And I don't know how you do not know that if this is the person that you're looking for. That's the first place you should be checking to see if he's already in custody. And in a case like that, let's wait till we see him go in the house before we try to take him down. And so no-knock warrants, I think, should be a relic of the past. The war on drugs has been a failure, and it's time for us to take a new approach to how we do with that. And you already know we've come up with some ideas that we're trying to in place, and hopefully we can get rid of this relic and stop the harm that it's caused so many people.
Thank you. And you talked about, new ways of doing things. Certainly 2020 brought to light a lot of opportunities to address some of these policies. And now that we know that there may be some issues with them, where do we go from here? How do we begin to address those things moving forward?
I think the big thing is just taking the ideas that we get from the Southern Poverty Center, the ACLU, the Georgia Justice Project, looking at some of the things that they've recommended, looking at our faith-based community, looking at our opiate community, the things that they've asked us to try to do to help stem these addiction issues. We've always taken the idea from the prosecution side that putting people in jail was the right answer. Sometimes that's exactly the wrong thing to do, because all we do is make them better criminals by placing them in jail. And we talked about this earlier for the nonviolent offenders. We can take them and restore them back to the community using different programs, different job programs, different educational programs, just helping them get a different mindset as to how they're to conduct their life and make our community safer. Because the ultimate goal for prosecutors should be to reduce recidivism. And that's how we make our community safer. By continually to place people in jail and saddling them with a criminal record, all we do is force them to continue to do that in order to get by. Too many times we have people that can't get jobs because of the criminal record, can't move up in their job, get promotions because of their criminal record, can't live in certain places because of their criminal record. And all we're doing is a disservice to our communities by doing that. We have to figure a better way, and that's why you see such a move towards progressive prosecutors who are focused on restoring versus punitive justice.
Thank you, DA Broady. And I personally can attest to your efforts in Cobb County to do just that. Thoughts from any of our other panelists? What can we do moving forward now that we've realized that there are some challenges with some of our policies or the way that we've done things in the past?
I think from a journalism standpoint, and as a journalist, it's just important to continue telling those stories, to continue talking to the organizations and the advocates and the victims' families to push for that change. And as journalists, I mean, that's to get those stories out and to ultimately help make that change.
Thank you.
So I'm going to beat my little organizer drum and I'm going to say, join an organization. Support an organization with your money. If you can't support an organization, if you can't join because you don't want to go to the meetings, and if you can't write a check, right, then find a way to spread the word about the good work that you are seeing. All of the people whom we lift up as master activists are really members of organizations. Dr. King was a member of an organization. Ella Baker was a member of an organization. Dr. Lowry was a member of an organization. Fannie Lou Hamer was a member and founder of an organization. And so we've got to look in our communities, find those people who are pushing for change, and make no mistake about it, all of the great ideas that government officials have ultimately have come from the ground because they have come from the people who are most harmed by a system, and the people come up with solutions. Even when we look at the Black Panther Party and we look at free lunch and free breakfast programs, solutions come from the people experiencing the problems. And so on any given day, and now because we're all at home, we can go to general body meetings from our homes, support and join organizations, engage. And if you're one of us boring lawyers, find ways to help out through political education and community so that people understand the issues that they're advocating around, because that education part is what makes them so much more powerful when they're in dialogue with decision makers in our government.
Thank you. Before I turn it over for any questions of our audience, oh, John, you are back, John. I'm so glad
Yes.
that you're
I
here.
apologize. We had an internet hiccup here at the Bureau.
Certainly, it happens. You know, that is one of the drawbacks to technology. But
Yes,
so
ma'am.
glad that you were able to join us as I asked all of our panelists a question of where do we go from here as we talk about different policies that can help address some of the issues that took place last year. Is there anything that we can do to address it moving forward?
Well, you know, the Apostle Paul says, having done all, stand. So I think this problem is bigger than just legislation, and we certainly need to address it through appropriate legislation, appropriate policies within our own organizations, but we need to address it spiritually too, because it touches on issues that are ubiquitous to mankind. So I would like, and I hope that we would all take our faith communities and incorporate them into our conversation too, because until we fix what's in our heart, there's only so much you can legislate evil away. And so that would be my suggestion.
Thank you. It's a great way to end the responses to that question. Meredith, I know you've been helping us with keeping us in order, and I know you've been also eyeing the activity of those who are watching us. Has anybody posed any questions to you for our panelists?
We do have some questions.
Okay.
One that came through the Q&A panel here is, how can we deal with the long-term impact of delayed prosecution? There are people with charges pending for 20 years who have never been prosecuted.
Can I speak to that?
Please go right ahead, John.
So before going into the Bureau, I was a prosecutor for 26 years. I am unaware of any case where there's a delayed prosecution of 20 years, unless it's somebody that didn't get apprehended for 19 of those years. The Constitution gives us the right to a speedy trial. Georgia law gives us a statutory right to a speedy trial. And every prosecutor worth their weight and worth their salt wants cases to be resolved quickly on behalf of victims. But we also want cases to be resolved well. Let me tell you, we got a tsunami of backlog because of the COVID crisis and the courts being shut down. With, I believe the PAC testified before the state's legislature just last week, there's an anticipated backlog of over 50,000 cases. No prosecutor, no county commissioner, nobody wants delayed justice. But what we do need to recognize is we need the resources to be able to ensure that there is no delayed justice. With that tsunami and backlog coming at us, we need more people in the court system in order to address this backlog. And that's the only answer. We have to put more bodies on the front line and resources to be able to make sure it's done correctly.
Thank you, John.
Yes, ma'am.
There's a clarification from our questioner that she meant deferred prosecution, not delayed.
Deferred prosecution?
DA, are you able to, DA Broady, are you able to weigh in?
You know, just like John said, it takes a lot of people, a lot of resources to get the court working the way it should be working. And with COVID, we're really in a situation where we've been restricted of what we can do. Most delayed prosecutions are because, like John said, the person has not been arrested, or we try our best to get people through the court system as fast as possible. And sometimes, because of our limited ability to try cases, that could be 4 or 5 years. That's why we have to come up with different programs, because I think what Nancy is trying to say is, what happens to that person who gets their life together while they're waiting to be prosecuted? And then once they get their life together, then boom, now 5 years later, they get prosecuted and they're going to jail for 10 years. Yeah. And that's where we have to strike a balance. For those people who are not a threat to the community, we have to strike that balance between punishment and restoration. And so that's where prosecutors have to think outside the box. Lots of times we have to talk to the victims to let the victims know what's going on, to make sure that they're up to date on what their prosecution is going through, and just have some kind of balance between the victim and the defendant, so that way we can go forward as best we can. But, you know, we don't purposely delay anything. The resources we have is what causes that delay.
Can I speak again to this issue?
Please, John, go right ahead.
Okay, so like, and I'm familiar with Cobb and Gwinnett and DeKalb because I've worked in those jurisdictions, and their numbers are fairly similar. In each county, District Attorney Broady this year is going to see 6,000 felony cases. Okay, so you got 10 superior courts. That's 600 cases per courtroom every single year. 600 cases. About 80% of those cases will be indicted. So we're talking 400 to 500 cases every single year, divided by 12. So we're talking 40 to 50 cases every single month without fail. And a trial for a felony generally takes 3 days to an entire week for just one trial. So you got 48 cases, 50 cases coming in, and you can only try one of them, because the Superior Court in any month has 4 weeks. You got criminal week, civil week, where you do divorces, you got child support, and then you got general motions and probation revocations. So 1 week a month to move 48 cases coming in. The numbers are just staggering. And now we got this big tsunami coming. So if there's been delays, it's because of those kinds of numbers that are being faced, and the system just needs a lot more support given to it.
I appreciate you helping to put that in numerical context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Meredith, do we have any other questions?
Qualified immunity. Thoughts on qualified immunity?
Who was that directed to?
Anyone, open to the floor.
I'll say this, qualified immunity over time, and both of the lawyers here can attest, the filing an action under Section 1983, let's say 20 years ago, looks really different than it does now. Your likelihood of success, your likelihood of successfully defending against a motion for summary judgment or a motion to dismiss a 12B6 is it's much lower now than it was, right? There's been like this erosion, and I understand the position that because of the nature of decisions that law enforcement must make, we have to have a certain flexibility and objectivity or subjectivity when determining what's appropriate. And at the same time, it is alarming the things that are permissible under this doctrine. And people often forget the suffering caused to communities and families when, let's say, when there's like no criminal liability, especially on the part of the claimant, on the part of the plaintiff, the suffering that families experience when they are unsuccessful in recovering damages against a law enforcement officer or any government actor who deprives them of a constitutional right. And so I align myself with those who believe that the idea of qualified immunity, especially as it has evolved today, serves as a detriment to America broadly, and that there are other ways to codify what actions are appropriate on the part of governmental actors. But if you see the cases that sort of just come across the listserv for plaintiffs' attorneys in this area of law, it can be very demoralizing. I'll just say that.
Anyone else?
I would say this, qualified immunity has its purpose, but I think at times officers or prosecutors or any government official can go beyond the bounds of their job, their duties. And when people decide to go rogue like that, then you have to rein in that qualified immunity. But most of us have SOPs or procedures that we're supposed to follow in our jobs. And as long as we stay within those procedures, then qualified immunity should protect us from any any suit that may arise out of our actions. But there are times when officers or prosecutors go outside those procedures. And then at that time, I think they should lose their qualified immunity. Mm-hmm. And it's a balance there. And like Tiffany says, the qualified immunity has really stuck its head out there in a greater portion of some of these civil rights suits than it has ever before. But I do think it does have its purpose, and it just needs to be limited in its scope.
Very good.
Our next audience member says, I see change coming from the top, police chiefs and sheriffs who looking upon themselves as public servants of their community instead of military leaders who believe they're in a battle with their communities. How can we attract that kind of leadership in an atmosphere where many sheriffs are elected and generally run on a strong law and order type campaign?
I'll take a shot at that. I think a lot of it has to do with the way we vote. We have to understand we have the power to dictate what kind of policies are placed in our communities, and we need to vote for those people who will do that for us. Police chiefs are hired by their mayors. Sheriffs are voted on by the community. District attorneys are voted on by the community. And you pick someone who's going to apply those policies that you feel are necessary or appropriate in your community. So it's important how important our vote is. Our vote is our voice. And for many of us, we don't realize how important these local elections are. We're okay with the big ones, the Senate, the House, and the president, but we forget that more important to most of us is those local elections and how they affect our daily life. So voting for those people who have like policies or like thoughts of yours is so important and so critical.
I would echo everything that DA Broady said, but I also want to point out what I hope is obvious, that the two are not mutually exclusive, that you can be a good leader and be pro law and order. That's just what I wanted to add.
Very interesting.
I'll add that when we talk about electing people who align with our values, the other part of that is what you do during those 4 years or those 2 years when they're in office. Are they held accountable to what they told you they would do? Or do they get a pass because you're embarrassed that you endorsed them and you don't want to say that someone you like made a mistake, right? That there is the voting, well, maybe not right now, is the easy part. And then accountability is the much harder part. And relationship building is really important. And I like what John said about faith communities. I'm the social justice chair at my church, which is Ebenezer Baptist Church. And we are really engaged in our social justice ministry. We deal with everything from access to healthcare to mass incarceration. And so finding your people and finding how they can engage on these issues for a sustained period of time is really important. I think that is just as important as making sure that you show up in November or January, whenever it is.
Yeah, definitely the power of voting. We've shared so many stories here recently of people who said they were fed up, and because they were so fed up, they were going out to vote. But going off of what Tiffany was saying, accountability, and you see a lot of that now, especially on social media, is that people are voting for who they want in office, but they're also keeping up with what that person is doing. And if they're not doing, what they promised to do or what they said they would try to do, you're seeing a lot of that conversation, especially on social media, happening where people are saying, hey, but wait a minute, you said you would do this, or what about this? So I definitely agree with that, accountability and following with who you're voting.
And Lisa, can I say one more thing on that too? Is we have to understand that when we vote people in, we can't let the emotion of the moment take us away from the big vision. And I say that because the case that we just recently had in our community, I actually brought in the local advocates, civil rights advocates, and some faith-based community to explain to them why such a decision was made. And after they saw why that decision was made, they understood, and they tempered their emotion for the moment because they knew why that particular decision was made, while other people who were not part of that meeting let their emotion override what the law said. And that can be a big issue for us, because as a prosecutor or as a sheriff, your ultimate goal is public safety and enforcement of the law. There's different ways you can do that, but ultimately that's what you have to do. They can't expect, because you're an African-American prosecutor, that now all of a sudden all the African-Americans are going to get a free pass. That's not the way it works. And we have to understand that when we bring people in, first of all, we should ask them to do their job the right way each and every time. And then make sure we hold them accountable for the things that they said they were going to do. But doing that job right, lawfully, is the most important thing.
Thank you, Flynn. Meredith, you have any additional questions?
Yeah, I do have another question. So we were hinting earlier at the Brunswick County DA's actions in the Ahmaud Arbery case. Now we're seeing back and forth in the news, between the Fulton County DA's office and the Attorney General as to whether the office may recuse itself from both the officer charged in Rayshard Brooks' death and the officers involved in the tasing incident that we talked about earlier. So now we're seeing this, more attention on potential conflicts of interest in prosecutors' offices. Under what circumstances can a DA's office seek a recusal, and why would the AG's office resist allowing a DA's office to recuse itself? Are there legitimate reasons, or is it just more politics as usual?
Looks like, go ahead.
In the situations where the Cobb DA's office recused, and this is prior to District Attorney Broady taking place, it would be for an actual conflict of interest, like former District Attorney Vic Reynolds was a criminal defense attorney, and when his former clients would come back before the court system, that was an apparent conflict of interest. But you can also conflict out for the appearance of impropriety. That's certainly appropriate as well. But I can't comment any further on the two examples that you gave, because the GBI was involved in the investigations of those two cases. So I can't comment, but it's certainly appropriate, because, you want to conflict out to avoid the appearance of impropriety, because you want to instill faith in the community that your DA is not compromised. Even if they're not actually compromised, even the appearance of it can really call into question the integrity of the justice system. And if we start losing faith in the justice system, which, part of this discussion is that a large segment of our population have lost faith, and we got to do everything we can to bring back faith in the justice system, because my goodness, it's our last greatest hope. So that's my comment.
And John is absolutely right. And that's why when I was talking before about bringing those advocates in to see why we did a certain thing, that's why we did that for transparency and to ensure faith in the justice system. And that's why a DA would conflict out. One, because as John said, the conflict of being prior representation. But I think in a lot of cases, that the two cases that you're talking about now, a lot of it is political reasons, because somebody tried to do something in order to boast their political chances, and necessarily, this is a hard one here, not necessarily because it was the right thing to do, but they did it anyway because they were trying to boast their political chances. And now they put that other district attorney in a position where, she can't go back, and going forward would be against her own values. And so now she said, okay, so I need to conflict out of this. But in this case, the AG said she couldn't conflict out. So I think that has a lot to do with it. You don't want to be put in a position where something has already been done that's against your values, against your beliefs. And now because your office has already made this position, you don't feel right going forward. Well, at the same time, people are expecting you to go forward because it's already been told that they will go forward. And so she's put in a conflict in that position, and it really is a disservice to her by the AG not letting her conflict out.
Okay. Well, we have go ahead, Tiffany, go ahead. I'm sorry, so you unmuted there.
That's okay. I want, I used to help run an ethics consortium at Georgia State's Law School. And I will say that that we believe that if what we're kind of whispering about is that DA Willis doesn't believe that the officers who killed Rayshard Brooks should be prosecuted, there is nothing legally binding her to moving forward with those prosecutions. And this is when I think we have to think about our obligations as attorneys as opposed to our obligations as politicians. I am not saying that the prosecutions were improper. I'm not saying that at all. But she has a decision that she can make. And we also need to think about the family of Rayshard Brooks and what they are experiencing in this moment. Sometimes we tend to look at only the party that we care the most about when we're talking about police violence. But let's not forget that a child lost their father on their birthday, only a stone's throw from a home he could have walked to. And due to a policy that now we have 311 where someone could have called 311 for Rayshard Brooks sleeping in that parking lot, and he could have gotten a non-law enforcement responder to come to that scene. But he is gone. He is dead. A family has lost a family member. And so in those instances, I think it is imperative that whoever is making the decisions does the right thing, not because they want to be reelected, but because it is the right thing to do.
Thank you. You know, as you talk about that, I think it's important to hit home what we started off with, that all of these things happen in the context of community, and they happen to people. They happen with people. And with everyone that's here on this panel, in your respective profession, you're a person first. And you know, my final question to all of you is, what is your advice to other persons in your profession as they deal with these issues? We talked a lot about solutions, what we could do moving forward, but what are some things people should be mindful of when they are addressing matters within the sphere of law enforcement and social justice issues? And I'll speak a little bit. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, as far as journalism goes, advice there, always get both sides of the story. Make sure that you hear from both parties involved, all parties involved, and also look for the stories that no one's heard yet, because, you know, whether you're talking about protests, you're always going to find someone out there who has a story, who's been impacted by something and is looking for a change. So you just never know where you'll find that story or what moment you'll be in where you'll catch the story and could ultimately result in change.
Thank you. Anyone else?
The thing I would say, Lisa, is we have to look at the whole community and the whole person when we start putting together solutions for the problem. And it's never a wrong time to do the right thing is the motto I try to use, and make sure that each and every person that I look at the good in them first. And then if I can't find good, then we go somewhere else. But if we can find good, let's try to restore that person back to the community. You know, when they're not hurting anybody, when they're not a danger to the community, that's our duty as prosecutors, as police officers, as community advocates. It's our duty to enhance our community as much as we can. And a lot of that happens through the law enforcement, through the criminal justice system. One thing I'll say, especially for our accountability courts, many of the people that come through, the first thing they'll tell you when they graduate is, if this hadn't happened, I probably would be dead. And I think we have to take that approach when we look at other people's. The sooner we can restore them back to the community as a productive citizen, the better we make our community and the better we make that person. And it's something that we all can work towards. It's a goal that we all can reach for.
Thank you. We have about 1 minute left. John or Tiffany?
I was just going to follow up on what DA Broady said, and then say you got to find the intrinsic, and remember that everybody has intrinsic worth and value because they're a child of God. And if you just keep that right, that's going to help you do the right thing at the right time for the right reason. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And finally, Tiffany.
So I'll quote Dr. King. He said, the benevolence can become egotism and martyrdom can become spiritual pride. And so I'm speaking to people who believe they're on the right side of justice. Decenter yourself, center the people experiencing the harm, listen and be a vessel. Don't chase news cameras, right? Jasmina is great, but what she needs is the information to get out to the public that can be most helpful and that is most authentic. And unfortunately, any PR campaigns that we as lawyers or advocates have for ourselves can cause great harm. So, get out of the camera and get to work.
Good. Well, with that, thank you to our esteemed panelists, Jasmina Alston, DA Broady, John Melvin, Tiffany Roberts. I appreciate you taking time out to be with us today. To our audience, thank you so much for tuning in and being a part of the CLE. Meredith, you've done an excellent job in organizing this event and giving us an opportunity to have some discussion on this very serious topic. And the Georgia First Amendment Foundation, thank you for all that you do in putting on this conference every year and being willing to address contemporary topics as they come up. With that, I'm Lisa Cupid, and I thank you for the opportunity to join you as moderator today. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Terrific panel. I just want to let everybody know what's coming up next. The next panel coming up at 4 o'clock is the media, our government and our politics, a discussion of media coverage of government and politics, moderated by Richard Belcher, with the incredible Jim Galloway, who's just retired as political reporter at the AJC, investigative reporter from WSB, Nicole Carr, Robin Kemp, dealing with the real world down there in Clayton County in a tiny newsroom, and Matthew Osborne in rural Georgia, the Northeast Georgian. That panel coming up at 4 o'clock. Check your email for the Zoom link to that. And thank you for a terrific day.